So we move to the adaptations that we have just talked about. Yes, they focus a lot on the motor neuron, but can actually be modified to apply to the sensory neuron and also perhaps to the relay neuron. Okay, so basically what we are saying is that relay neurons connect from the sensory neurons, and then of course they can pass through the central nervous system, but again from the central nervous system, that's when you have the motor neuron coming in. So that means that in between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, you have the relay neuron. That's why we term it as the intermediate neurons. Okay, they can be, of course, they have the parts like what the sensory neuron has, what the motor neuron has. So they have the cell body. What can you notice from the cell bodies of these neurons? The cell bodies can be at one extreme end. If it is at one extreme end, then we say that is unipolar neuron. If it is in the middle, that means you have two extensions. That means that is a bipolar neuron. And then if you have several extensions, then you can have it being termed as multipolar neuron. Okay, so they can be multipolar, they can be unipolar, or bipolar. The point is that they are between the sensory, which takes the information. The relay is the one that connects between the sensory and the motor neuron. So comparison in terms of structure, and motor neuron, they are usually unipolar, and then interneuron, which are basically the relay neuron, they have multiple extensions, and that is basically logical because they terminate into the ends of the relay neuron. They end up with the other neurons. Okay, so that means this end you need to have dendrites, and then the other end you also need to have dendrites. So possession of multiple extensions is logical in that case. Sensory neuron, usually two extensions, long dendrites for sensory neurons, and then with the axon, the interneuron and the motor neuron, they have short dendrites. And then we move the cell body. So you can notice here that actually the relay neuron is entirely in the central nervous system. Okay, and then for the motor neuron, you have the cell body in the spinal cord, and then the axon is done, which extends outside. Remember, the motor neuron is the one that takes the information for action. Okay, takes the information for action, and that information comes from the central nervous system. Okay, and then for the sensory neuron, you have the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion outside the spinal cord. Okay, so in terms of function, the sensory neuron carries this information to the spinal cord. But within the spinal cord, that's when you also have the interneuron, and then that interneuron again connecting with the motor neuron. So that means that the interneuron collects the information from the sensory neuron and then takes it to the motor neuron. And whereas the motor neuron takes it to the organs that are supposed to implement a physiological response, whether it is muscles contracting, whether it is about an organ increasing the rate at which it works, all that information is carried by the motor neuron. The axon and dendrites, you basically know this because it is the axons that give the neurons that extensive distance that they can cover. And we have seen that they can actually be long, and even in terms of meters. That is the axons. They carry the information away from the cell body. And then the dendrites are the ones that bring signals to the cell body. So that means that they pick these signals from, it can be from another neuron, or it can be from receptor cells that detect stimuli and then send this information to the dendrites, the cell body, and then to the axon. The axon is smooth, and then whereas the dendrites are rough, we have some what we call dendritic spines. And then the axon, usually one per cell, whereas the dendrites, you can have several of them. Ribosomes cannot be found in the axons, but the dendrites, they are present. You have the myelin sheath and the axons. You may have, it's not all the time that you have the myelin sheath there. With the axons, you don't have the myelin sheath. The branching, the axon branches away from the cell body, and then the dendrites branch near the cell body. Okay, so what is unique about these neurons in comparison with other cells? Basically, neurons, the major feature is that they carry electrical impulses. But they are also similar in terms of structure with other types of cells. They have a cell membrane, contains the nucleus, cytoplasm, mitochondria, and other organelles. Okay, so that means that they can carry out all the other very important physiological processes. Okay, so the uniqueness is in terms of possession of dendrites and axons and ability to transmit electrical impulses. And then the points where they connect, where you have neurons connecting, is what we call synapses, which you basically don't have on this side. So you don't have the normal cells, the normal other cells that we have. They don't have the axon, they don't have the dendrites, they cannot transmit these electrical impulses. So they don't have synapses and also neurotransmitters. Okay. These neurons cannot do their work without the support of other cells. And therefore, these cells that support these neurons are the ones that we term as the supporting cells, or we can call them generally as neuroglia. So these neuroglia actually provide very important functions. They provide nutrients to these neurons. They remove wastes. They participate in synaptic transmission and also form part of what we call the blood-brain barrier. And of course, the Schwann cells, we know that they produce myelin sheath. That is very important for insulation and also speeding up the rate of transmission of impulses in the peripheral nervous system. Now we have the oligodendrites, dendrocytes, these are cells that produce the same myelin sheath, but this time they produce it in the central nervous system. That marks the end of this presentation, where we have looked at neurons. So neurons transmit electrical impulses. Okay, from where you have this stimulus energy being picked by the receptor cells, and then the sensory neurons carrying this information to the central nervous system. And then within the central nervous system, that's where you have the relay neuron that will also connect to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron will be the one that end up in what you call effectors. The effectors can be muscles, can be glands, can be organs that will basically respond in the most appropriate way based on the information that has come from the central nervous system. Thank you.